It is now my pleasure to introduce Ioannis Dimitrakopoulos, FA, the Fundamental Relations Agency, Fundamental Rights Agency, to come up and take the floor. And I will say that FRA, as you heard already, pioneered the first survey a number of years ago asking Jews in Europe about what they felt, their attitudes toward anti-Semitism as they perceived it and felt it, and has been a forerunner and is now embarking on another project, a little bit more elaborate successor project. So I hope we hear more about the good work that FRA is doing on this issue. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I have the difficult task to follow an excellent speaker like Rabbi Baker, and at the same time to respect your basic fundamental right to lunch. So I will try to be as brief as the topic allows me. Let me start by thanking the organizers for this excellent event. Of course, the richness of this event that looks at all different facets of the issue of anti-Semitism, the issue of Jews in Europe and around the world, cannot be covered within a couple of days, but I think this event is a very important contribution. While the conference discusses, of course, anti-Semitism as a global issue, my own contribution will focus on Europe, and more specifically the European Union. I will speak briefly about two interrelated issues. First, on what we do as our core job, namely collecting the evidence on the extent of anti-Semitism. And second, also part of our core job, on what action is taken across Europe to tackle it. Now, you've heard again and again, but I will repeat it, that Europe has been home to millions of Jews for many centuries, and they have contributed in making this continent one of the richest and most highly developed regions in the world. At the same time, however, throughout these centuries, Europe has also persecuted and finally almost exterminated its own Jewish population. After the Second World War, we all thought that finally anti-Semitism and its dire consequences were coming to an end. The European Union itself was built on the ruins of the Second World War. It was built on the ashes of Auschwitz and Mauthausen. And in 2012, let's not forget that the Union received a Nobel Prize for having contributed over 6 decades to the advancement of peace and reconciliation, democracy and human rights. Nevertheless, and despite the Union's efforts to implement various legal and policy measures, intolerance and hate, as you've heard from many speakers, persist, not anymore as marginal phenomena as we had in the past, but having gained electoral ground as part of the political mainstream. The recent march of the far right in Sofia, controversial legal initiatives and statements by politicians in Warsaw and elsewhere, ongoing anti-Semitic attacks challenge the legally guaranteed fundamental rights of Jews in the European Union. That's a right, these are rights that they have like everyone else, to life, to human dignity, to freedom of thought, conscience and religion, as well as to non-discrimination. The Fundamental Rights Agency, our agency, is the official human rights body of the European Union. It is tasked to collect evidence that can assist EU institutions such as the Council, the Parliament and the Commission, as well as national governments, to take measures to ensure respect of fundamental rights. And in regard to anti-Semitism, we do this by asking, first of all, national authorities for data on incidents that they have, and by examining also data by civil society. Based on this evidence, we report annually both on the availability of data and on trends in anti-Semitic incidents in the EU. What do we find? Well, as regards official data, first of all, let me clarify that still only a few member states record anti-Semitic incidents in a way that allows them to be processed and in a way that allows us to compile adequate official statistics. The inadequate recording of hate crime incidents, including those of an anti-Semitic nature, and in particular those of an anti-Semitic nature, coupled with the victims' hesitation, I will say a few things about this later, to report such incidents to the authorities contributes to a gross underreporting of the extent, nature, and the characteristics of anti-Semitic incidents. This, of course, as you can understand, limits the ability of policymakers to act effectively, to assess the impact of existing policies, and to do something about it. Incidents that are not reported are also not investigated, and therefore they are not prosecuted, and that, of course, allows offenders to think that they can carry out such attacks with impunity. Victims who do not report their experience to authorities will also not benefit from wide-ranging support and assistance which is today available to them, largely thanks to EU legislation already being transposed into national law. However, even when official data do exist, they're still not comparable, not least because they are collected using different methodologies and using different sources. They range, just to give you an example, for 2016. 4 in Belgium, 3 in my own country, Greece, 7 in Spain, 1,468 in Germany, 335 in France, and so on and so forth. These figures are, at the end of the day, more useful for analyzing the data collection system than they are for telling us what is the situation concerning anti-Semitism, what is the situation on the ground. Of course, we also look at non-official data. We look at collections of complaints, incidents of every kind done by civil society organizations, including by Jewish organizations, Jewish communities. Again, there, we find that in most EU countries, such evidence is not collected in a systematic, robust, and most importantly, in a comparable way that would allow us at least to compare this evidence. The inadequacy of both official and non-official data has led us to conduct our own investigation. We did this 5 years ago through a large survey. Now, what do we mean by a survey? Usually, major surveys ask a sample of the general population about their views on how widespread is anti-Semitism in society. Our surveys are different. They ask instead Jewish people themselves, and in this way, they give a voice to these communities to recount their experiences of violence, of verbal harassment, of discrimination, and also to tell us how important this is for them, how it affects their Jewish identity, their Jewish life, their sense of belonging, and their future. I won't overwhelm you with figures, but the results of our first survey show that every 5th Jewish person surveyed had experienced either a physical attack, serious harassment, or verbal insults. That's not something that happens to everyone every day in European streets. 3/4 of all our respondents considered online anti-Semitism a very serious threat, intensifying the fear and reinforcing feelings of vulnerability. Close to half of all respondents were worried about becoming themselves a victim of a physical attack, and more than half of the respondents worried about potentially a family member becoming a victim of such an attack. Now think about this. If those who said in the survey that they had actually experienced either violence or serious harassment or even threats had actually reported this to law enforcement authorities, to the police, at least in those countries where hate crime victims can register anti-Semitic incidents as a bias motivation, we would then have recorded hundreds and hundreds of such incidents. This is not the case. So underreporting is a very important problem. Almost 2/3 of the respondents who had themselves experienced violence or threats of violence did not report this to the police or even to a Jewish organization. And when we asked them why, most of them said because nothing would happen or change by reporting it. And this is something where we need to pay more attention to. We published the results of the first wave of our survey back in 2013, and I'm happy to say that now my colleagues and other friends, some of whom I see in the audience here, are preparing the next wave of our survey. This time we are expanding the survey to more countries with more financial resources, so we will be covering Austria, Denmark, the Netherlands, Poland and Spain, in addition to the countries we already had covered before, which was Belgium, France, Germany, Hungary, Italy, Latvia, Sweden and the UK. Let me now move very quickly to the second part, action. What has been done and what should we expect more to be done? First of all, let me just clarify that the work of our agency is not simply to collect data. Our raison d'être, the reason for our existence expressed in Article 2 of our regulation, says that we are there to provide assistance and expertise to EU institutions and member states to help them make the right choices and the right policies to protect fundamental rights. So our work is to a large extent about helping to bring about change. Let me briefly therefore outline how the work that we've done, the data that we have collected, the surveys that we have carried out, triggered a series of events that show how the EU has been responding over the past few years to anti-Semitism. Within a month of publishing the results of the survey back in November 2013, the Justice and Home Affairs Council of the European Union issued formal conclusions asking for additional and specific action and measures to tackle anti-Semitism and hate crime, December of 2013. A few months later, in April 2014, our agency started working with a number of member states to assist in their efforts to encourage reporting of hate crime. A year later, in October 2015, the Commission held its annual Fundamental Rights Colloquium on preventing and combating anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim hatred in Europe. In response to its conclusions, again in December of 2015, Katharina von Schnörbein was appointed as coordinator on combating anti-Semitism, and I would just underline the very, very important work that she has carried out since then. Now, we are still in December 2015. A few months later, in June 2016, the Commission forms a high-level group on combating racism, xenophobia, and other forms of intolerance. Through this group, it steps up cooperation between governments, between member states. It reinforces what Rabbi Baker was saying is very important to achieve, an acknowledgement and an understanding by governments that they need to act. In September of 16, a few months later, FRA is asked to coordinate a specific subgroup of this high-level group to deal with one very important aspect I noted before, which is the recording of the hate crime. Does the police have the right tools to record hate crime, to record anti-Semitism as a biased motivation for crime? And we started this process of assisting member states in developing better tools to frontline law enforcement officers, not theoretical, not in ministries, but for the frontline police officer to be able to record it better. And we do this in very close cooperation with the OSCE's Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. It's ongoing work, and now we're at a stage where we will be working with specific countries and specific police forces to see how this can be translated into action on the streets. And I would like at this point to highlight that this important work, this work complements very important work done to improve the reporting, with a P this time, reporting of hate crime, which is done by civil society initiatives, such as the one started and now being coordinated by the Jewish Contribution to an Inclusive Europe, SEJI. And it's a project that stands out as a best practice. It's called Facing Facts, and I see Mike Wine, who has been one of the leaders supporting this project. It has managed to create very strong partnerships with a range of similar initiatives and has really contributed in improving the reporting of hate crime, as well as responses to hate crime more generally. Now, in May 2016, the European Commission also moved in the area of hate speech. And a very important contribution was an agreement with the social media companies Facebook, Microsoft, Twitter, and YouTube on a code of conduct. This code of conduct countering hate speech, according to EU law, there's a framework decision, criminal law in the EU, which forbids all publicly inciting to any conduct publicly inciting to violence or hatred. The commitments under this code of conduct included commitments by these IT companies simply to take out of circulation, to take offline any such material that was reported to them to contain hate speech, to be anti-Semitic, and so on. Just a month ago, in January 2018, the third evaluation of how the implementation of this code of conduct proceeds was quite positive. So the results, I don't know if other speakers have mentioned them before, but show that IT companies removed 70% of such content that was notified to them. And there are a number of civil society organizations and others who notify such material. Ladies and gentlemen, I will not continue for much longer. I just want to conclude by stressing that the collective efforts of governments, the European Union institutions, and civil society to actually end anti-Semitism are ongoing. While this end may not yet be actually in sight, we cannot allow ourselves either to be discouraged or to be complacent. We must persevere, and we will persevere as an organization until the time comes when we can relegate anti-Semitism to its rightful place, something I always like to say, which is the ash heap of history. Thank you very much for your attention.